Welcome back to News Talk, everybody. I'm Bruce DuPoit. Well, he was National League Manager of the Year last year. Now he's out of a job. Matt Williams fired by the Washington Nationals after a disappointing season, one that at its beginning had the club going to the playoffs and possibly the World Series. None of that happened. Now Williams has been given his walking papers. Joining us now with analysis, Tom Threlkeld, Editor-in-Chief of the DC Pro Sports Report. Welcome back. Good to have you here.
Great to be here, Bruce.
It's being Chris Miller on Twitter says this was a tough decision that needed to be made. I'm struck by the use of the term needed.
Yeah.
Explain what you believe went into the decision, presumably by the learners, perhaps Mike Rizzo, perhaps all of the above, to say to Matt Williams, sorry, we're going to go in a different direction.
Yeah, a tough decision because he only got 2 years here. And I'm sure a tough decision for Mike Rizzo personally. He and the general manager, Mike Rizzo, he and Matt Williams are friends and have known each other for well over a decade, dating back to their time when they were both in Arizona with the Diamondbacks. And it was, you know, this, I believe it had to be made. I agree with Chris on that because it was clear that not only were they losing games that they ought to have won, but that he'd now lost the clubhouse. I think it was, if Williams, I thought he was probably going to be fired anyway, but the final straw had to have been the fight between reliever Jonathan Papelbon and the team's star Bryce Harper that Williams seemed completely unaware of, you know, and sent Papelbon out to the mound after it had happened. Nobody seemed to have told him what was going on. He had confrontations with some players, specifically Jason Worth. I'm talking about the Matt Williams again. You know, about whether or not he, you know, had a handle on the team and whether or not he'd lost the players. And I think it was pretty clear he'd lost at least some of them. And, you know, his inability to handle the bullpen. He was handed a bad card there, a bad hand, I should say, with the bullpen, but he didn't handle it well. He seemed sort of stuck with a sort of paint-by-numbers kind of attitude toward managing. There was no imagination. It was sort of like if you plug this situation into a computer, it spits out this. He just went by a rule book. He didn't seem to have a real feel for the games. And so now he's gone after what seemed like a fairly promising beginning for him in the year 2014 when most things went right, at least until they got to October.
Is there a case to be made, and I will agree with you that some of the issues that surfaced publicly, and who knows what's going on behind the scenes, the things that perhaps have been festering for a while, the things that we never become privy to, or you only get the sort of one side without the other side to balance it out. But is there a case to be made that with the three things, injuries, every team has injuries, but the Nationals were really bitten hard by the injury bug.
They had their planned lineup together for 2 games this year.
Oh, I thought it was only 1. Okay, so whatever. Yeah. So they essentially never had their preseason gold-plated all-star lineup as the lineup. So significant injury problem. Significant underperformance by not one, not two, but several players, and a bullpen that was flawed from the outset that he had to pace together and do the best he can with. Can you make the case that he's not the GOAT in all this? He's the hero that kept the team relevant despite all the things I just mentioned.
I would make the case that he's a hero. I would make the case that there's a lot more blame to be spread around than just Matt Williams. Mike Rizzo compiled that bullpen. A lot of people said beforehand that it was a major problem. He didn't do anything to address it. And again, on July 31st, that's the turning point to the season, the trade deadline when the Mets made a number of big moves, specifically getting Yoenis Cespedes, who really paid off for them. Whereas all the Nationals did was bring in Papelbon, and that turned out to be a disaster. As far as team chemistry and as far as performance. Drew Storen went into the tank. Papelbon.
Drew Storen, whose numbers to that point were
fantastic. That's right. He went into the tank. And the bullpen fell apart. Out of their last 20 save opportunities, they saved only 9. Worst in Major League Baseball. That's completely unacceptable. And I think Williams made that situation worse with his uncreative way of handling it. But he was given a bad bullpen to start with. There's no doubt about it. And I think Rizzo was far too wedded to his plan. His view was, I've put together this team. It doesn't need any altering. We just need to wait for guys to get healthy. And he was wrong. And yeah, there were injuries were a problem, but you know, I think the Cardinals had just as many injuries as the Nationals did, and they won 100 games.
Underperformance was a big problem.
That's right. I mean, even when they were healthy, guys like Zimmerman, he performed well for some of the time, didn't perform well at others. Jason Worth wasn't good. Ian Desmond has played his last year. He's never been with anyone but this franchise. He's played his last game. It was not a good season. Denard Span was injured constantly. So they had major problems. Really, out of the bats, the only two guys who consistently played well were Bryce Harper, of course, who's probably your MVP, and then Yunel Escobar. Injuries to Anthony Rendon, a big problem. But they didn't respond well to those injuries. They had other guys, and they just didn't get enough. And there were major problems with the starting pitching, which was, if you remember, at the start of the season, was supposed to be historically great, one of the all-time greats.
Right.
And then Strasburg was dismal before the All-Star break. He was great afterwards, but before he was a real liability. Max Scherzer, who was great at two no-hitters, but he had a stretch there in August where he was just no good at all. Ryan Zimmerman didn't pitch up to his potential.
Sure.
Doug Fister was no good, and some of these guys are gone. Fister and Zimmerman have also pitched their last games with the team almost certainly.
Can you talk about the managerial search?
Right.
I mean, there's so many questions and so many things to talk about. The bottom line, the 2016 Nationals, it seems, are going to look a lot different than the 2015 version and the 2014. Absolutely,
there'll be some major changes. I think the starting pitching, they'll bring back Strasburg and of course Scherzer and Gonzalez, and they'll probably go with Tanner Roark and Joe Ross, knowing that Lucas Giolito, their sort of star pitcher in the system, will probably make his debut in 2016 as well. I think as far as managers go, if it was me, I would look first at Terry Francona, who has an opt-out from the Cleveland Indians. If he opts out, I would grab him. If he doesn't, I think there's Charlie Manuel, a guy I like a lot, and Ron Gardenhire. I think guys who've been in similar situations where you've had teams that have struggled with pitching and also with hitters sort of underperforming and who've managed to coax good seasons out of them. That's where I'd go. Now I've heard some talk about potentially going after Cal Ripken Jr. That's very juicy. Obviously, Nationals fans would love it, and it's certainly a way to stick it to Orioles fans. But I think one thing they might look at is they grabbed a rookie manager in Matt Williams, and it didn't work out. And should they really go back to another rookie manager, or should they try to find someone with a little more experience? This is just a guess on my part, since this news is really just breaking. But if I had to guess, I would say that they would probably go after someone with more experience. I will say this: Mike Rizzo was true to his word. He said a decision would be made very soon after the end of the season, and he was Johnny on the spot.
What about his future? Does he get a pass in the team's underperformance?
I think this will hurt Matt Williams. There were a lot of questions about him basically for at least half the season, despite having a Manager of the Year award in 2014 for Matt Williams. As for Mike Rizzo shouldn't have a pass. There should be questions about Mike Rizzo's job here, and there aren't, at least not that I've really heard. But it wouldn't be a bad idea, I think, for the Lerners to bring in sort of an old hand, someone who can have a look at the whole sort of a Pat Gillick type, to sort of look at the front office and say,
this is like a senior advisor?
Yeah, right. And to look at Rizzo, get another set of eyes, get another opinion, and look at whether or not this team is really being put together the way it ought to be. Because Rizzo was far too confident in his own plan and far too inflexible in switching from it when I think there was abundant evidence that it wasn't working.
We have about a minute left this segment. Is there a takeaway in terms of all the talk? I mean, of course, when you assemble a great lineup, and this was a great lineup on paper, but did the talk hurt, in addition to being inaccurate and not, the predictions didn't bear out? Was there something else about the heightened discussion of World Series?
Did they believe their own press clippings? They very well might have. Now you can't say that happened with Bryce Harper, a guy who's frequently accused of being too full of himself. He came through and did his part, almost won a batting title, and just had a fantastic season. But yeah, I mean, I think there was particularly, again, in Rizzo's case, I think there was a sense that this team is really good. We just have to wait. We give it enough time, it'll come through. And it never happened. And frankly, for the most part, it never looked like they were really even close.
It didn't. We had about 5 minutes of pennant race, and it was
that's
nice
right.
while it lasted, but that wasn't the expectation. Talking with Tom Felkout of the DC Pro Sports Report. Back in a moment.